We are now starting Unit 3, so just a quick update to this point. We have revolted against the British. Now we have a new constitution, and under that, we are starting with our first president, George Washington. So, as you see here on your Unit 3 Lesson 1 guide, at the end of this lesson, you'll be able to describe the challenges facing the new nation of the United States. You'll be able to explain how Washington had to set many precedents for the presidency. We'll explain what the word precedent means in a minute. And then you can examine what Washington warned about in his farewell address, not failure address. So you'll have this video. The slide deck is linked here that I'm going to use in just a moment. Your guided notes. There's an Edpuzzle on Washington's farewell address. It's very short, and then that will all prepare you for your mastery check today. So the presidency of General George Washington. George Washington served as the general under the American Revolution. If you can think of him as like the LeBron James, or think of the most famous person in America today, that was George Washington. Every single person in the United States knew who George Washington was. So in 1787, when we establish our new government, he will be the unanimous, meaning everyone voted for him, decision to be the first president. So as we just went through your lesson objectives, here they are again. So to review, after the new Constitution is ratified, which means approved, he becomes president in the executive branch. So the new Constitution, different than the Articles of Confederation, set up 3 branches of government. So George Washington served under the executive branch here. Okay, he was the president, and his major responsibility is to enforce the law. You have the legislative branch and the judicial branch, and all of these work together in a system of checks and balances. This is a review back to your class that you took in the 8th grade, which went over how the Constitution is set up. If you have any questions or you want to talk about this more, please let me know. So, being our first president, there were lots of things that George Washington would be the first to do. That's what the word precedence that you see here means. He did it first, so then everyone else would follow his lead and do it the way George Washington did it. That's what a precedent was. He establishes the structure of our judicial system. He creates the first presidential cabinet, which will be his team of advisors. He created the title of how we would refer to the president. He establishes the idea of calling the president Mr. President. And then he also established the authority for the executive branch to enforce laws, which is the major thing that the president does. And then lastly, the one major precedent that he sets, he limits a president's time in office to 2 terms. So the Judiciary Act of 1789, when the Constitution is created, Article 3 outlines how the judicial branch, which is our court system, would work, but it doesn't really deeply explain what it would do. So the Judiciary Act creates a Supreme Court that would include a Chief Justice, somebody that was the head person above the Supreme Court, 5 associate justices, and then also below that, we'll have federal courts, federal district courts, state court decisions at the state level could be appealed to a federal court, and then a federal court can also overturn the state's court decisions. So the Supreme Court, when you see that word supreme, just think of it as like the highest court of the land. Everything in all of our court systems, we have state courts here in Massachusetts, but then there's also federal courts under the United States government, but the Supreme Court is all the way at the top. So what is a presidential cabinet? This is what the president uses. Think of it as like his team of advisors. They give him advice on how to deal with things. Most people that are president don't know everything about everything. So George Washington wanted to surround himself with people who better understood policies. He asked Thomas Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence, to be his Secretary of State. That person would deal with foreign issues. This is probably the most important person in a presidential cabinet to this day. They deal with, the president cannot be everywhere at all moments. They're typically the ones that are traveling around the world, meeting with leaders from other countries. Alexander Hamilton, who served under George Washington in the American Revolution, serves as his Secretary of Treasury, dealing with economic issues. There's Hamilton there. Secretary of War, dealing with military issues. Henry Knox, who was a general in the war himself, gets chosen to do that. Today, we call this cabinet office the Defense Secretary, right? Secretary of War sounds like we're like actively seeking out a war. He's the Defense Secretary today. And then the Attorney General is the lawyer for federal government, and this is Edmund Randolph. This is important in helping develop policy that would shape the country. There's still a cabinet today. The cabinet today has grown to almost 35 members. There's lots of different things that the president looks to advice on. The Food and Health Administration, we have somebody that looks at, dealing with diseases, dealing with Homeland Security, how we keep ourselves here. Today's cabinet is very large and includes the vice president. So when Washington becomes president, some wanted to call him Your Majesty or Your Excellency. And he said, well, I'm not a king, right? We fought against the idea of having a king. So Mr. President is what he chose. And it's still what we use today. So the big job of the executive branch is to enforce the laws. Washington sees this firsthand during his presidency when there's an uprising in Western Pennsylvania. The government realizes very quickly that it needs to make money. So they pass taxes on liquor to help pay the debts. People that made whiskey comes from grain. So anywhere where wheat or grain was grown at this time in Western Pennsylvania were very angry. Also, think of Western Pennsylvania as the frontier. They were also upset about the lack of protection from Native American attacks. So in 1792, farmers begin to protest taxes, right? This is going right back to what happened in the American Revolution. Washington said these meetings are illegal. Tax collectors are attacked. They talked about seceding from the United States. So Washington himself gets on a horse and leads armed troops to end the rebellion before it spread. And what this did was set the idea that citizens have to obey laws passed by the federal United States government. And it's under the president's executive power to make sure that those laws are enforced. So if you think of it as like Congress can pass taxes, right? So under the executive branch today, who makes sure that you're paying your taxes and those taxes are collected? The IRS. The IRS is an organization that's under the control of the executive branch or the president. One of the major things that Washington does is he believes it's dangerous to allow somebody to serve for a long period of time. He, again, does not, we are not a nation that is operated as a monarchy. So he said, when it comes time to run for a third term, he does not run. He wants to show that we are a nation capable of peacefully transferring power from one leader to another. So even though this was not a law, every president after him follows that and says, I'm not better than Washington. He served 2 terms. I'll serve 2 terms as well. And this happens until Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and 1940s, who actually runs for 4 terms in office. Obviously, we were going through the Great Depression and World War II, so he felt that that was necessary. After Roosevelt dies, we add an amendment to the Constitution that formally limits a president from serving more than 2 terms. Another major thing that Washington had to deal with was foreign issues, so issues happening with other countries. France, after us, gets into their own revolution. As it becomes more extreme, you might recall the guillotine, beheading people that were against the revolution. Many Americans stopped supporting it. Eventually, other European nations will go to war with France because they're worried about the revolution spreading to their nations. So Washington kind of feels as though he has to respond, but what he decides to do is he does not want to get involved in these international issues. So he has a document of neutrality. The United States is not going to choose sides. We're going to stay out of it. So this leads to a debate between the political parties that Democratic Republicans supported France, Federalists supported a relationship with Great Britain. Those were the, two political parties that were coming into fruition at the time. Hamilton and Jefferson argued that neutrality was best. So France becomes angry with us. And then we also have issues with Great Britain. Great Britain kind of sees us as, their younger son or younger kid that now has gone off into the world, but they're kind of like bullying us around the world. So we're kind of attacking their ships, they're attacking our ships. They're still out in the Northwest Territory and they're giving guns to Native Americans and encouraging them to attack us. Great Britain does not think that this idea of independence is going to last. They don't think that we're going to maintain the ability to stay an independent country. So they're looking for an opportunity to kind of gain that territory back. So we passed Jay's Treaty. It ended fighting between the US and Great Britain in 1794. And then lastly, we're also dealing with Native Americans as well. We continue to move west, which Native Americans do not appreciate. They almost feel like they would rather have us still be controlled by the British because we're becoming so actively awful. So, lastly, in September 1796, Washington makes the decision to not run for a third term. So, him and Alexander Hamilton formulate an essay essentially that will become known as the farewell address. Please watch the Edpuzzle on the farewell address. This is an extremely important document because in it, Washington says there's three things that are going to weaken the country. We're divided. The South and the North don't get along. There's a lot of regional differences. And he foresees that us caring more about our region and not the nation itself could become a problem. He also sees these new political parties being an issue. It's causing conflict. If these parties spread, they could also divide us as a nation. He just really wants us to be united. And then he also says when it comes to foreign countries, foreign powers, other countries, we can't trust them, that we cannot make alliances with foreign countries, that they're always going to be looking to take advantage of us. We should support trading with them, but we cannot become dependent on them. And basically, we cannot make political connections with other foreign countries. So please, understanding the significance of Washington's presidency is just big, that he is trying to figure out how this brand new nation is going to survive. And there's a lot of things that he has to navigate that will help kind of set up like what the presidency will look like. That's the major thing that I want you to take away from this lesson today.